is doing, the rise and fall of liberalism.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I recently read this book by Patrick Deneen called Why Liberalism Failed, a very fascinating book, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And in conjunction, I realized that Yuval Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, which you might have heard, history professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, he also has some thoughts on liberalism and where it's going in criticisms of it, and I thought that it would be really interesting to put the two together because they are complementary, and in some ways I think they are contradictory, and I'm curious to see after I'm finished what you guys think and how can the two be put together, or are they totally contradictory? So if you're living in the West, liberalism is in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and in the pot we smoke. Liberalism is like the core religion of the West, one could say. From free markets, individual rights, equality, separation of church and state, all that good stuff is from liberalism. And I'm talking about liberalism in the philosophical sense, as opposed to like liberal versus conservative, which are both basically two different flavors of philosophical liberalism. So given that it's so pervasive, it's like and we're not really aware of it, like fish in water, it would be good to examine these waters. So I'll be saying a little bit about liberalism in general, and then Patrick Deneen and Yuval Harari's view of it. And it's going to be descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm going to be preaching to nobody. And the prescription, interestingly enough, is not even available. I mean, both of these authors have said what they're saying in the past 4 or 5 years, and liberalism has been around for, if we go back to, say, Hobbes, almost 400 or 500 years. So this is these criticisms are new. The prescriptions, we can discuss, but they're both of these authors just have some ideas, but they don't even claim to have the solution for the problems that liberalism has introduced. So where did it come from? What is it, and what are its problems? So there's many Enlightenment philosophers that contributed to liberalism. I'll say a little bit about 4 of the key people. And that would be Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, and Mill. The first 3, Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke, all 3 are English. Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke went to Oxford or Cambridge, one of those 2. Mill, on the other hand, never went to school or university. So Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1629, is the father of empiricism and the scientific method. And Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary, was his secretary for a little while. And he's mostly known for the book Leviathan, in which he has the first detailed explanation of social contract theory, which I will get to in a little bit. I looked at Leviathan because I didn't know much about it. So it turns out Leviathan is a sea monster from the Old Testament, and it's analogous to Tiamat in Mesopotamian culture. I don't know if any of you have heard Peterson talking about Tiamat and defeated by Marduk. So Tiamat is analogous to Leviathan, and both of them are kind of analogous mythologically to dragons. They represent, they're a metaphor for a powerful enemy. So Leviathan, dragons, or Tiamat are metaphors for a powerful enemy.
But in the book, Hobbes' book, it's not meant in a negative sense, is it?
Actually, I couldn't exactly figure out why. That was my next sentence. I'm not sure why he named it that. Most other books by him and by Locke are like treatises on government or etc. Why exactly he chose Leviathan? What I could find is that perhaps it's because it's a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
So that's only in that sense did he choose the name of the book. Social contract theory, which is the basis of liberalism, it is about the legitimacy of the authority of the state over the people. So people surrender some of their rights to the state in exchange for protection of their other rights for maintaining good social order. Like most other ideas, the idea of social contract apparently started with the Greeks, but took shape during the Enlightenment by Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and a bunch of other enlightened philosophers. The other important concept here that Hobbes uses for his social contract theory is the state of nature. Suppose suppose we think of a human and cut all their culture and where they grew up, all that out. That is how he thought of a human in their state of nature. So actions are only bound by personal power, and he thought that people, would plunder, murder, if it was in their self-interest. So this is not rational self-interest as somebody like Ayn Rand would talk about, but this is just self-interest, just take whatever you can. So Hobbes's really famous quote actually refers to this state of nature as being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's probably one of the most famous quotes ever, and it's by Hobbes regarding the state of nature. So for him, the solution to the state of nature is the social contract. Give up some of your rights in order to get protection from the state for your other rights. So the book Leviathan is about the structure of society and legitimate government. And then Locke was also partly a contemporary of Hobbes. He's considered the father of liberalism, and he was an empiricist following Francis Bacon. In his version of social contract theory, human nature is characterized more by reason and tolerance. So different people have different ideas of what humans in their state of nature is like. His writings were a big influence on the US founding fathers. The phrase life, liberty, and property are his. In the Constitution, they changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the US Declaration of Independence. And also, interestingly enough, he believed that in certain situations, a revolution is not just a right, but an obligation in certain situations. So that's another connection to the American Revolution, potentially. Another interesting thing about him that I found out was that he was the first to define the self through a continuity of consciousness. That's a kind of interesting side idea outside of liberalism that I found interesting. And then finally, John Stuart Mill. So these Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke are like late 1500s to late 1600s. And I thought all four of them would be in the same timeline, but no, actually John Stuart Mill was born in 1806, so that's like 100 years after John Locke died. So there's three of them, and then 100 years later is John Stuart Mill. The most influential British thinker of the 19th century, never attended school. He was a fan of utilitarian and built on Jeremy Bentham. And his book on liberty makes a strong case for the defense of free speech. He's well known for the harm principle. The only reason power should be rightfully exercised is if any member of a community, a civilized community, the only reason power should be exercised against somebody's will in a civilized community is to prevent harm to others. That's another famous quote by him. Interesting thing about him, he defended British imperialism. He said that India and China were once great civilizations, but right now they're stagnant and barbarous, and that legitimized British rule over them. A famous quote by him that I've heard a lot, it's interesting, is he who knows only his side of the argument knows little of that. Okay. So put all these together and some other thinkers and you get liberalism. So what is liberalism in general? It's a project to liberate individuals from their culture and focus politics on individual rights and improving people's material conditions. So you get a system of political and moral philosophy based on liberty, consent of the governed, equality before the law, limited government, individual rights, and free everything. Free markets, free speech, free press, freedom of religion, etc., etc. And in the Age of Enlightenment, it became really popular with Western philosophers, and its purpose was to replace norms of heredity and privilege, like the monarch is just the monarch because he's the monarch, but why should that be the case? It should be more meritocratic. Replace the divine right of kings, so the kings were thought to have divine right to be where they are. And liberals also wanted to end royal monopolies, barriers to trade, and promote free markets. So that's the general view. Yuval Harari's view is quite complementary to this and takes sort of maybe a psychological different view. He says that liberalism is a philosophy which puts the individual as the source of all authority. So you have this inner voice or the soul, and that inner voice is the source of meaning in life, and you're supposed to connect with that inner voice because it's the real you. So when you vote, what are you doing? You're looking inside, oh, I'm going to vote for this person. That inner voice comes from a space of complete freedom, as like kind of a not free speech, what is it called? Determinate free will, thank you. So free will is kind of a part of liberalism. So there's this source, you can call it a soul, you can call it an inner voice, whatever. That is the source of meaning. It comes from a space of freedom, and only you have access to this inner voice. Hence the need to ask for everybody's vote because you don't know what they think. So we have to preserve the freedom of an individual to feel and think and act according to this inner voice because it's the supreme source of authority and meaning. So if you have to make a big decision, go up in the mountains or look at the sea, get in touch with your inner self and make a quote-unquote free choice. And it's almost like, you can think of it as a soul, but scientifically, it almost sounds like this view means that your DNA fully determines who you are, independent of the environment. So it's almost like culture is some crap around who you really are. You have to clear the cultural crap to access the inner you. That's kind of that. This last part isn't my own formulation. That's not attributable to anybody else. So you want to connect to this real you, and this view manifests itself in different ways in society. So for politics, it's voter knows best. In economics, the consumer is always right. If you can gather all the geniuses to build a car, if they build a car and it doesn't sell, it's considered a bad car. The car is good if it sells. The customer is always right. Art, in the case of art, the liberalist view is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There's this famous piece by Marcel Duchamp, I think it is, a French artist who, in a gallery, he puts a urinal, just a regular urinal, and calls it art. And you can find this in any art history textbook. And when the prof talks about this piece by Marcel Duchamp, he'll lead a discussion. Is it art? Is it not art? What is art? And if he believes in liberalism, he will guide the discussion towards the end point, which says, it is in the eye of the beholder. If you want to say it's art, it's art. There are no objective standards. In ethics, if it feels right, do it. It's inside of you. It's not forget scripture, forget whatever. If it feels right, do it. And he gave an interesting example. During the Charlie Hebdo affair, people were saying that, at least some people in the Muslim community were saying that what Charlie Hebdo did was wrong because it hurt the feelings of Muslims. In other words, it depicted the Prophet Muhammad in that way. So again, it was bad. If somebody's taking that point of view, it's bad because it hurts people's feelings. Feelings are, because feelings in the inside you is legitimizes good and bad, right and wrong. And in education, you can teach history, physics, whatever, but you know the prof believing in liberalism will say, okay, yeah, I teach physics or history or whatever, but ultimately what I want to do is get students to think for themselves. That is the liberalist point of view, for better or worse. Yeah, so for better or worse, this is the current religion that we have here in the West. Its authority comes from the state of nature. In other words, like Hobbes saying, Hobbes or Locke, the state of nature is the human without influence from culture and other externalities. And yeah, so the state of nature, and from that follow these kinds of rules for behavior. So I'm gonna just stop for a second there. Any comments about this view of liberalism, the first one or the second one, or anything before we go on to further problems?
Not yet. No.
Okay.
I think it's the next part. It's going to be the part that generates the
Okay.
discussion.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so that's the system we have. There's no question that it's led to amazing prosperity and peace for most of the West and Western Europe and North America. And its achievements have been pointed out big time by people like Steven Pinker in his last two books. All the many statistics of child mortality going down, the percentage of people under the poverty line is going down really, really fast. So there's and nobody is disputing any of that. So one way to look at Deneen's criticism is actually to contrast it with Pinker. He doesn't dispute Pinker. He argues that liberalism has failed because it has succeeded, interestingly enough. So we've gained all this wealth and progress, but lost meaning, cohesion, and community. And it's based on in his view of liberal. So liberalism, the idea of liberty originated in Greece, and their idea, which Deneen likes, is one that talks about freedom as freedom from our desires and material needs. So it's about mastery of these natural urges in favor of self-control, restraint, and education into virtue. So it doesn't consider individual as separate from the community, but individual is part of the community. They're not two separate things. And they might look at our freedom and think that it's full of chaos and slavery to desire. So, because if things are as good as Pinker says, why is there so much depression, addiction, and loneliness? I was just coming on the radio and CBC was talking about the loneliness epidemic. So the material successes of the West seem to satisfy, this is my own formulation again, the material successes seem to satisfy the lower parts of Maslow's hierarchy, if you want, in favor of the higher, which is meaning, community, cohesion. So classically, liberty was much about stoicism and self-limitation, and it's interesting that recently, in the past years, you hear stoicism coming back. In other words, it's not like do whatever the hell you want, but more like limitation and self-control for a long time were lost, and now it seems like society is starting to come back to it. But yeah, so liberalism seems to reject this kind of self-limitation, and it relies on laws alone. In other words, motivate behavior externally as opposed to internally through social norms and culture, and have it, not just rely purely on external motivation. Another interesting thing that Deneen talks about is sort of the liberal versus conservative. So the left, or we could call them progressive liberals, seem to want a bigger state to get more rights. On the right, the conservatives or classical liberals are more interested in individualism. And the interesting thing that Deneen points out is individualism, statism are advancing together. They're sort of mutually supportive, and they cooperate in the expansion both of statism and individualism. So somebody like Reagan comes around and says, government is not the solution, government is the problem, but he doubles the size of government. So whether they're Republican or Democrat, government seems to be getting bigger, because in order to give all sorts of individuals their rights, let's say LGBT, etc., you need bigger government to give more individuals more of their individual rights. So this is a sort of an insight that he has that I've never heard before. So we sometimes think as liberal and conservative kind of in a push-pull situation, but it seems more like they are mutually reinforcing each other to make government bigger. So bigger state to get more individual rights. Yeah. So and by doing that, they're expanding the power and authority of the state. Yeah. And also people in general become more atomized and less involved in voluntary associations and communities as they're being individualized. So you got a bigger state and individuals becoming more atomized. And the third critique is that liberalism is anti-culture. In other words, it homogenizes everything. So the only forms of shared culture are celebrating the liberal state or the liberal market, like Black Friday. So that, let's say that inner core, liberalism tries to strip people of their culture, religion, their place, and homogenizes culture. So, and the Francis Bacon introduced the idea of sort of the conquest of nature and man versus nature. That through science we gain control of nature. So these are, according to him, three of the pillars of how liberalism is anti-culture. While the word culture, as in agriculture, does have to do with nature. But in a Francis Bacon way, it's like man is separate from nature and we have to conquer nature. And the second pillar is time as a past, as present, and future as foreign. So time and place itself doesn't have is fungible and doesn't have much meaning. So culture is a function of nature, time, and place. It would be these three pillars. And liberalism, by redefining these, it makes it easy to take culture out of the equation. And as this empire of liberalism grows, As the empire of this is a direct quote from Deneen. As the empire of liberty grows, the reality of liberty recedes. So, political correctness, Bill C-16, etc., etc. So the empire of liberty is growing. Yeah, and so we have the dissociation of nature from culture, because liberalism's natural condition is defined by the absence of culture, the state of nature. And while culture in a pre-liberal view, like the classical view, has a connection to nature, as in Plato's Republic. So that's a little bit about Deneen's ideas on liberalism. And then a few comments about Harari's very different criticisms of liberalism. He says that the most profound idea in biology since Darwin in the past 150 years can be summed up in 3 words. Organisms are algorithms. There is no soul, there is no real you. You are made up of a bunch of biochemical algorithms. The cell has an algorithm to reproduce. There's an algorithm to produce this protein, that protein, and so our body is a kind of like a machine. That's kind of the